imperial message. The emperor, so a parable runs, has sent a message to you, the humble subject, the insignificant shadow, cowering in the remotest distance before the imperial sun. The emperor, from his deathbed, has sent a message to you alone. Who is the emperor? Might the emperor signify a divine being? And why is this divine being perhaps sending a message to you? He's about to dictate this message to the messenger, who will thereafter attempt to run through the crowd, through the gates of the outer palace, towards you, wherever you are, dreaming the message to yourself by the window. This emperor, and what is the significance of his dying? That in his dying act, he has tried to reach out to you. Why is that? What is the significance of that? And also ask, why has Kafka chosen to write to you as the second person in this parable? Typically, stories involve first-person narration or third-person, a third-person narrator. The narrator won't actually be a character in the story. It'll just be a fly on the wall. Kafka always pay attention to imagery of darkness and light. Don't necessarily jump into an interpretation scheme saying light is the law, it's some higher kind of order or goodness, and darkness is either lost in absurdity or an irrationality that, while it can succeed in business, it can't attain understanding or intellection of this higher order, perhaps of the palace of the emperor. That might be useful. Not necessarily to succeed at business, but to work for a business. Go to work every day. Wake up at the same time with an alarm. In the extreme case of Gregor Samsa, he was waking up at 4 a.m. every day or earlier to catch the morning train. So to be or become a human being who is and has to be very predictable in this state of servitude. This imperial court, you could argue, well, there's some absurdity too. Speaking roughly, hand-waving, but the messenger from the emperor himself cannot reach you because of the throngs of immediate subjects, the many princes, a great ring, the princes of the empire. So celestial order, as it were, of the sun is also asked if the emperor is God or signifies God. Because the emperor is on his deathbed, does Kafka allude to Nietzsche's statement through Zarathustra that God is dead, we have killed him, and so on? So a parable runs. He has commanded the messenger to kneel down by the bed and has whispered the message to him. I'm going to try to edit the sound. I didn't realize that the rattling of the book would cause such an annoyance. Kafka closely may be interpreting. Always pay close attention to the verbs. You may want to underline them or write them down on a separate piece of paper. Not necessarily counting the frequencies, but comparing uses of verbs like whisper, for example, in other parables or short stories. I believe that the verb whisper is used significantly in the first parable, here labeled before the law, and in other short stories. Just to name a few, the Hunter Gracchus, maybe a special whispering also occurs in the Metamorphosis, I think the Hunger Artist as well, and the Judgment, to name a few among many in which this action occurs. It's a special kind of communication. It's not so much what is sent through the whispering, but the whispering itself is part and parcel of what is sent. Kafka closely may be interpreting. Always pay close attention to the verbs. You may want to underline them or write them down on a separate piece of paper. Not necessarily counting the frequencies, but comparing uses of verbs like whisper, for example, in other parables or short stories. I believe that the verb whisper is used significantly in the first parable, here labeled Before the Law, and in other short stories. Just to name a few, the Hunter Gracchus, maybe a special whispering also occurs in the Metamorphosis, I think the Hunger Artist as well, and the Judgment, to name a few among many in which this action occurs. It's a special kind of communication. It's not so much what is sent through the whispering, but the whispering itself is part and parcel of what is sent. Closely read maybe to ask, why has he said what he said, or rather, why has he written as he has written, being the author. And I say this, or I ask this, trying to get away from even my own typical metaphysical-like misunderstanding of texts, as though plot were a surface and just everything that's said is merely a superfluous overlay of a simple underlying message that may be much briefer, for example, if it could be said directly. And I don't have the answers at this point, but I think that this entire outlook is a mistake, whatever its usage as a gateway into literature might be. In this art of close reading, the interpreter or critic has in mind a subject in a kingdom who cannot speak openly for fear of persecution. Again, we allude to Leo Strauss, the philosophy of Leo Strauss and the close readings of the ancient philosophers and also their successors in the Islamic Middle Ages. Now, in this case, what's the problem in the modern world, wherein we supposedly have freedom of speech? To re-allude to the kind of psychological model of interpretation, I would suggest that science is actually conscience, or the censor, that statements that aren't in accord with the primacy of space as absolute space, a three-dimensional or more system in which where distances and so on, even the distance between your head and something you think about is more important than the who you are as an individual, what species you are, humanity, the speaking animal, and the thing itself of which you speak. Oh, it's just an object just like any other. It's species, even if it's an ape or marble, that's insignificant. So I would suggest that the modern writer of short stories, whatever problem he's dealing with, if he has to write in parables or indirectly, maybe it's an attempt to bypass a kind of scientific, that is the kind of science that is spatially fundamentalist, is mathematically or quantitatively in the sense of numbers. If it's fundamentalist in that sense, not just science as knowledge. So a kind of scientific censor. In the mind? Is it in the mind? I don't want to say it's in the mind because that reconcedes the jurisdiction to space. The writer cues you in that this action is significant by repeating it in the parable itself. So much store did he, the emperor, lay on it, that he ordered the messenger to whisper it back into his ear again. That's a very explicit repetition. It becomes a motif in the very same sentence in the parable. Motif in a short story is going to be an image that's repeated with some variations like light, glistening, gleaming, the imperial sun as opposed to the darkness, shadow. Motif may take the form of a repeated action, even with some shades of variation, like the whispering in this parable and in the previous one. And how would you describe a motif in terms of painting, the history of painting, especially Italian art during the Renaissance and thereafter? You might think, well, this is an image in a painting or a part of a painting, or maybe a human being represented in the painting is wearing a special kind of clothing that is a response to another artist's rendition of the same. Camille Paglia has suggested that the Venus that's displayed in Botticelli's painting, that the body of the goddess is actually modeled upon Donatello's David, a sculpture, in fact, of a beautiful boy, whereas Venus herself, female, voluptuous, but maybe not so much. So that's one suggestion, that the form of the body has transferred sex from male to female. To repeat what might be, in fact, an entire philosophy, that these sexual personae are the recurrent archetypes throughout Western art. So it's not necessarily an image or an abstract form like a circle or a triangle in geometry, but complete and archetypal who's, W-H-O apostrophe S, to make a plural of that kind of question. So complete beings, which may be gods, demigods, mortals, and so on. Dionysus prefigures Christ, or even that Isaac, the son of Abraham, who might have been sacrificed, also anticipates the sacrifice of Christ in the New Testament. It bothers me if things are said to be so and the reason can verify, but the intuition is left hungry. So how does Dionysus prefigure Christ? I think it has to do with the wine. This is a red wine. I think it's an Italian wine. Dionysus was the god of wine, among other things, though not to be confused with Bacchus, the mere debauchee or debauchee. And where does wine figure in Christianity? The blood of Christ, the Last Supper, the transubstantiation, and so on, the bread. The term motif might actually remind of archetype in art. Not necessarily archetype as a kind of abstraction, but I think archetype as a specific repeated image. Now, to appoint a task, what would be a prime example of such an archetype or motif in the visual arts, or maybe in film, that we could draw upon as our substantial example? To go back to this theme of the law, in the first parable, for example, a man from the country is waiting, I think, by the gates. He's at the outermost ring by the first doorkeeper, and the problem is that he can't access the law. What does it mean, however, symbolically, that he can't access the law? Is this merely a parody of the bureaucracy in Eastern or Central Europe at the time, and probably still so today in that part of the world? In this story, the law is trying to reach you yourself. In the other story, the law, or rather the man in the country, is trying to go to the law, and now the law is trying to come to you. What similarity do you, as a reader seeking some kind of enlightenment, have to the man in the country? To the diction itself, the choice in words. Then by a nod of the head, he has confirmed that it is right. English translation, but maybe the German is Recht, and Recht is also the term for law. if I'm not mistaken. If I am mistaken, please leave a hateful comment down below and click the dislike button. I guess this is YouTube. How would we describe the messenger? So to skip a few sentences after all the obstructing walls have been broken down, but which again signifies some kind of obstruction between the law and you, but skipping that, going ahead to the messenger, he sets out on his journey, a powerful, indefatigable man. Is this messenger merely a man, though? But messenger also means angel, and Kafka freely uses theological imagery, even if he isn't directly concerned with the law as acting rightly or justly as either a good citizen or a good follower of a religion, compliant. The understanding of the law seems to be access to a higher plane of truth, which is mostly hidden. Maybe it would be useful to remind ourselves of Plato's myth of the cave. That is the myth of the cave that Socrates relates in one part of the Republic for whatever purpose. Of course, he is talking about justice. So the myth of the cave is told in the context of a larger conversation about justice. So it's not necessarily, does Kafka care that you not eat pork or some kind of forbidden meat, or that you don't drink wine, for instance? Is that what's meant by law? And aside from Kafka, in a legal religion, that is mostly the case, that the state as it is ought to be the one state throughout the world, or at least the code that governs the behavior of a nation. Or are we left to ask what he means by some, I don't know, higher order understanding of the text? I have some idea here more about the lawmaker than the law itself. Is the law, insofar as it governs behavior, merely an exoteric ritual that the real thing sought is the mind of the lawmaker, or how the early lawmakers were in direct communication with the lawmaker himself? Just a suggestion to go on or open the discussion that why would Kafka use the law as he does in these short stories? When we, that open question, what we is actually named in this casual sentence, but typically when we approach or reread Kafka, we read the phrase the law. We assume that it's merely symbolic, has nothing to do with Moses, the Mosaic law, stonings, and so on, or that something like this, an idol or fetish, would be strictly forbidden, the graven image of an animal. And I might have been joking around when I opened this digression, but the uncanniness of horrific punishments, blood and death for something like this, or for eating pork, while that aspect of the law, what B.F. Skinner would call behavioral, maybe, the behavioral, if there is any other aspect of the law. Anyway, the penal colony, the uncanny punishment that the old commandant seeks as a pathway to enlightenment, that might be the key to, I don't have a key, but that might be the key to unlocking or closely reading these details in Kafka. What's not only between the lines, but I think pervasive but unsaid, do not matter. Let's return to the parable. So who is this messenger? How would we describe him? The story himself shows him in action. So he's a powerful, indefatigable man. Okay, we have adjectives, but the action, now pushing with his right arm, now with his left, a kind of athletic description, a kind of male or masculine vitality. what significance does male strength have in these short stories by Kafka? Masculine strength be only part of the content of the story, not necessarily the message that he wants to deliver. For example, the father of Gregor Samsa, once he, I guess he recovers from his stupor, from his weakness, and he again finds a post working at the bank. He described in much more vital, healthy terms the old man, the hale old man of great vitality. And he makes a similar transformation that Georg's father in the Judgment makes. When Georg notices this, he says, "My father is a giant of a man." These images of male vitality, especially the strong father, in contrast with the scrawny son, of which we may see examples in Kafka's letter to his father. I would suggest that this father-son relationship, the strong older man to the weak younger man, this kind of relationship, for the most part, provides content or material for the short stories. I don't think it's the main message if we want to run the risk of devaluing the plot, the story, and say, well, all this is just a vehicle for delivery of a higher message, contrasting the transformation that Gregor Samsa's father makes in the Metamorphosis with the transformation of Georg's father in the Judgment. And we'll continue with this digression for just a little bit more. So in the beginning, to offer one more footnote, what do adjectives being the prime beings, good and evil, for example, if good and evil, these qualities perhaps, or one value and another extreme devalue, everything could be described in terms of this light and dark, the forces of good against the forces of evil, that even God himself is just a representative of the good, Satan of evil, and so on. How far do we want to go with that? It is worth noting that the book of Job can be read as an introduction to this absurdist genre, and also the play by MacLeish J.B. So it's not completely out in left field or completely absurd to problem that adjectives are the prime beings as such. Well, typically an adjective is said of something else that's more complete, like this shirt is pink, or this t-shirt is orange. It's said about them, and these qualities don't merely exist as such, at least if you follow the philosophy of Aristotle, which the moderns entirely reject. Complete things, whether this work of art or the wine of a specific strain of grape grown somewhere in Italy, maybe with volcanic soil, that these individual complete things, of which we could speak of the taste, for example, the touch, this is kind of cold, might be made of brass or kind of inferior gold, that the moderns, of course, reject that, or the Cartesians reject that and say, no, anything, whether this camel, this graven image, this camel, or this jar of water too, is just an accidental convergence of two molecules of hydrogen and one of oxygen. Things that can be measured, things that are quantitative, not qualitative, but a quantity technically is just a special case of a quantity. Of a quality. A triangle has 3 sides, a square 4, and so on. Now, why do we bother making this digression? Because I think the unhappiness that Kafka's characters face in the story is largely due to the domination of science, that the problem isn't that the law isn't being followed, that society, to abuse that term, is acting wickedly in defiance of the law, making idols, eating pork, and so on. That's not the point at all. The entire point. completely. Why did he write the penal philosophy of spatially fundamentalist science that anything that we speak of, that we ask, well, what is it? This is a pen. It's an example of a pen. That anything is an accidental convergence of more universal currencies. For example, to continue the metaphor, that one company might sell toilet paper, another company might sell books, but at the end of the day, they're just worth billions of dollars. One might be worth millions and so on, but they reduce to comparable currencies, just as the colors red and blue reduce to mutually comparable wavelengths, different lengths of, I guess, the troughs of light, however it works, if you measure light as a wave. Now, alternatively, you say, well, light is a particle. Light is composed of what Newton called corpuscles, or corpuscles. And nowadays, the term photons would be used, photons that are somehow interchangeable with electrons, or ignite them, charge them, excite them. That's the term that's usually used. It's a false dilemma whether, is light a wavelength or is light a particle? Because in both cases, the scientist is trying to reduce something special, I guess a star, and maybe the light of fire. He's trying to reduce something arguably particular to something more homogeneous. To simplify the interpretation, to supply the teenage mind with a facile schema to categorize the images in the story and the events and the plot, we speak of these concepts: order and the absurd. Something is orderly or it is absurd. And we deliberately make the mistake to make adjectives the prime beings in this universe of Kafka. To continue on this simplistic pathway without any obstacles between us and the law, it's as though Gregor Samsa's father makes a transition from absurdity or alienation back to order, the kind of rational order capable of victory in business, good health, but not necessarily able to interpret either the law or certain holy texts, not capable of that kind of enlightenment. And so, almost done. What's his name? Georg's father in the judgment, he was weak, he seemed sickly. He was reading a newspaper from many years ago. These are symbols of his so-called alienation from order, the usual routine of things, in contrast to the younger son, Georg, who is vital in business and so on. He's concerned about his money, property, and his upcoming marriage as well. Georg's father needed assistance to get in bed. Georg had to assist him in moving his father from the kitchen into the bed. And of course, later on, it was a great surprise that the father was standing upright of his own accord, like Atlas, with his hands in the ceiling, holding the globe. He encounters resistance. He points to his breast, where the symbol of the sun glitters. So glitters is one of those luminescent verbs that should draw your attention, like light. The way is made easier for him than it would be for any other man. And this repetition of man, I don't know, but it begs the question whether he is a mere man or an angel. Whatever the angel might signify in this strange mix of theology and bureaucracy. If he could reach the open fields, how fast he would fly. And soon, doubtless, you would hear the welcome hammering of his fists on your door. He could reach the open fields, maybe the country. Observations. Very often in Kafka, the adjective, if it is one, or an adverb, doubtlessly, it's doubtless here, is used to call your attention, then it's as though the narrator deliberately speaks credulously with an excess of optimism in our ability to understand it. Secondly, the masculine, the images of masculine vitality, the actions, hammering of his fist. The fist is the image. He's strong, points to his breast. Maybe he has a broad chest as well. Why has Kafka chosen this image, the stature of the strong male, to represent the law in this case? Is it just an accident? Access to the law. The hunger artist seems to be very weak, for example. He's been fasting for weeks. His muscles are probably withered away. Characters that are sickly, that they're not actively employed, they nonetheless seem to have some special insight. The country is dying and his sight is failing, so his health otherwise is also failing. Only then does he perceive the glimmer from the last gate, or from wherever it is in the first parable, in which the man from the country applies to the law and waits. And how vainly does he wear out his strength? One additional avenue of interpretation is some kind of psychology or mind is in play here. So, welcome hammering of his fists on your door, as though some thought were trying to enter your mind. And in the Metamorphosis, we also see Gregor Samsa actually locked or contained in his room for the most part, and he hears different voices knocking on various doors or walls in the room, offering information or influence of some kind. I wanted to continue on this psychological pathway. I'm not sure why my hand is offering roads, avenues, and so on. But we have options. That's the point. So to continue with the psychological possibility, you could say that, the law, the emperor, God, it's one part of the mind, or you could say it's the unconsciousness, the unconscious part of the mind, and consciousness itself is alienated from that part of the mind. So although man, to speak of the human condition in general, may succeed in building cities and establishing some kind of businesses and orderly customary life, for lack of other details to explain what we mean by order. That nonetheless, in this kind of banal order, and typically where science and mathematics rule, that also some kind of unspoken happiness. The artist type, this kind of human being, is who would like to interpret the law or understand the ancient texts, or the higher order of things, to speak vaguely, is beset by a kind of unspoken unhappiness, a kind of misery or lack of satisfaction from the food available to nourish him, that he has some other hunger which can't be satisfied by the structures, institutions, ideology of society. It's as though, if we want to speak of parts of the mind in this kind of maybe Freudian psychology that Kafka may have been aware of, that one part of the mind is trying to reach another, but between the two there's not just one but many walls, a kind of labyrinth between the two. And maybe at one age in the history of humanity that these parts were unified, or they were one integral part. But and as I separated, though, messages could be exchanged between the two. But then thereafter, perhaps due to the rise again of spatially fundamentalist science and mathematics, which confer technical power but great misery, So perhaps after or during this phase of history, messages can no longer be communicated, and the price of great technical power and wonderful medicines and vaccines, the price is a kind of poorly enunciated misery, which at least the artistic kind of human being falls into, and I think maybe even the average human being as well. And it's not about it's as though if we want to speak of parts of the mind um, in this kind of maybe Freudian psychology that Kafka may have been aware of, that one part of the mind is trying to reach another, but between the two there's not just one but many walls, a kind of labyrinth between the two. And maybe at one age in the history of humanity that these parts were unified, or they were one integral part. And as I separated, though, messages could be exchanged between the two. But then thereafter, perhaps due to the rise again of spatially fundamentalist science and mathematics, which confer technical power but great misery. So perhaps after or during this phase of history, messages can no longer be communicated, and the price of great technical power and wonderful medicines and vaccines, the price is a kind of poorly enunciated misery, which at least the artistic kind of human being falls into, and I think maybe even the average human being as well. And it's not about, and the parable continues. Nobody could fight his way through here, and why? The center of the world, the imperial capital, crammed to bursting with its own sediment in the sentence before. I'm not sure what that means, but nobody could fight his way through here, even with a message from a dead man. But you sit at your window when evening falls and dream it to yourself. So the emperor is described as a dead man, but yet at the same time, the parable hints that he is the emperor of some kind of higher order. And so the difficulty of any emperor, maybe in Austria-Hungary, for example, which Kafka grew up, the difficulty of the emperor or the king or the Kaiser in the highest court, it would be difficult for him to communicate with a specific subject in a village far out of the capital. So, I mean, that kind of fact at least supplies the content for the story. But you sit at your window. So again, the direct address to the reader in the second person. What effect does that have? Why is it chosen? And what does your window mean? Are you on the edge of your conscious mind, peering into the vastness of unconsciousness? I'm not the biggest fan of this distinction, conscious and unconscious, but it's a useful two-pronged fork to have at your disposal when evening falls. So as the light transitions to the darkness, and dream it to yourself. You don't think it to yourself, you dream it to yourself. So the verbs, even describing what Descartes would call mental operations, the verbs describing mental operations are nonetheless very carefully chosen in this work and throughout the work. Example of what questions you might ask and details you might notice in this parable. On the road, to continue this, on the road towards an interpretation, if you want one single coherent, authoritative interpretation for this, and I'm not necessarily against the kind of imperial, the imperial aspect of one ruling interpretation, the truth, so to speak. But I want to caution against overvaluing interpretation and devaluing plot, and very simply enjoying a story just as you would enjoy the color and detail in a painting. That might be useful. Not necessarily to succeed at business, but to work for a business. Go to work every day. Wake up at the same time with an alarm. In the extreme case of Gregor Samsa, he was waking up at 4 a.m. every day or earlier to catch the morning train. So to be or become a human being who is and has to be very predictable in this state of servitude.